Welcome back to Cherish Ephesians 6:4. The article titled this week is called Music. Can you handle the truth about it? Of all the articles I've written, this one might garner the ire of more Christians than any. Let me start by talking about the amazing attributes of music in general. Music has the ability to change our mood, to give us comfort, to hype us up, to cause us fear, and to reduce anxiety. It can influence behavior. It can help you memorize things more easily. It can make you forget about where you are or what you're doing. How all this happens is not completely known, and that should be no surprise to us because music and the ability to use it for good is a gift from God. Music is truly amazing. But just like every other good thing the Lord has provided for us, there is a being known as the destroyer, or the devil, who is roaming about this world looking to pervert every good thing from God and turn it into something that will bring all kinds of harm to people. We learn from Ephesians 6 that this devil is wily. He is sneaky and crafty and devious and hardworking. And some of the things that he does in the world are barely noticed by Christians. Therefore, Christians leave their minds and hearts unguarded against his devices. There is no question in my mind that music is one of those gifts from God the devil is using against us. In this particular tool of the devil, we only need to go back to the garden to see how he works. There, Adam and Eve are using the gift of words to communicate with God in perfect harmony. The devil does not come up with a new way to communicate with Adam and Eve, but uses the same means to tempt Eve to eat from the forbidden tree. He takes God's word and perverts it to fool Eve. Fast forward to today, and nothing has changed. In Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17:17, he prays that his Father would sanctify us by the truth using his word. It is through God's word that we grow in our faith and think and act more like Jesus Christ. This is a critical component for the Christian life, as God has determined that his Spirit will use the power of his truth to change us. The words of God's truth are communicated to our souls through the reading of his word, listening to his word through recordings of the Bible, preaching and teaching, or through singing or listening to music. We find singing throughout the Old Testament during times of worship and thanksgiving, as well as times of fear and tribulation. One of the most revered books in the Bible, the book of Psalms, is a book of songs. The Apostle Paul knew this well, and during his time in jail, we read that Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. It's Acts 16:25. Additionally, Paul wrote to the Ephesian church and Colossian churches and instructed them to address one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, Ephesians 5:19, and to let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thanksgiving in your hearts to God, Colossians 3:16. We also know from the book of Revelation that there will be singing before the throne of God, Revelation 14:3. Note, all of these songs are filled with words that build up the heart and mind of the believer, or, to put it another way, to sanctify us in the truth. But what are we filling our minds with? Are the words of our songs pleasing to God, or is it of this world? Let me quote John Piper on this point. Quote, "There is such a thing as worldly music. One of the marks of worldly music is the exaltation in a worldly view of life. A worldly view of life is a life that leaves Christ out and approves of whatever he disapproves. That is worldly. Worldly isn't a sound. Worldly is leaving Christ out. That is why it's called worldly and not Christly. And it approves of what he disapproves. It's called worldly because it treasures the world above the one who made the world. It revels in the very self-centeredness that gives rise to the miseries of the world." Unquote. Okay, so let me stop right here to say something, because I know that there will be some who listen to this and look for any small exception in order to dismiss my entire point. I know that because that's what I do when my flesh doesn't want to hear the truth that convicts me to change. So when I'm talking about worldly music, I'm not talking about every piece of music and every song that doesn't specifically mention God or Christ. There are probably a million songs that have been written about many wonderful and beautiful things in life that reflect God's creation or His general good to all people. In that same way, I am also not talking about the incredibly beautiful music that has been written through the years that doesn't even have lyrics. I'm talking about the never-ending production of songs and lyrics that convey an unbiblical view of relationships, portray fornication as normal, ultimate happiness through anything but Jesus, divorce as indifferent, materialism as essential, authority as something to be ignored, perverted sexuality, the abuse of women, manipulation of people, racism, power through violence, and self as being the number one thing every human being should be most concerned about. And that's the short list. This is the work of the devil using words to train our brains to think in all sorts of godless ways. And your response to that is, songs don't affect me in that way? If you believe that, you have an argument with God Himself, who put the following in our Bibles because He believes it does matter. He commands that we pay attention to every thought and deed for which we will give an account. Listen to God powerfully speak to us in the following. Romans 12:3. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Colossians 3:1-2. If then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. And then finally, Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Of course, these commands are not relegated to one part of our week, but it is to be on the mind of the Christian 24/7. Also, God does not want a part of our mind and heart. He wants all of it. There is no part of our lives that He's not sovereign over, and expects that we would be willing to walk away from anything that He hates. In fact, Jesus has purchased us for His Father with His precious blood. Therefore, we're no longer slaves to anything sinful, but now we are to be slaves to righteousness. How hard is it for Christians to walk away from their love for secular music? I think it's incredibly hard to do. Why? Because our hearts have been trained to love it for decades. For most of us, secular music is not something we sought out on our own. Many of us were introduced to it by our parents or the culture we grew up in, and we were never warned about the danger. It took hold of us and became part of our psyche. But that doesn't mean God will give us a pass on this part of our lives. Anything that God hates, we must hate. And if we don't, we should be concerned for our souls. John Piper had an interesting question, which I'll share here. He said, "The issue is whether we are at home in enjoying ourselves with the way the world thinks." Let me say it again. The issue is whether we are at home in enjoying ourselves with the way the world thinks. That's Piper. Which leads me into some thoughts about our children. For the sake of the hearts and minds of our children, Would you be willing to do for them what nobody did for you? Or maybe a different incentive to change would be helpful. If you want to lessen the chances of you having misery during your child-rearing years, would you be willing to deal with the issue of ungodly music now? In other words, you have an opportunity set before you to stop the kind of training of your child's mind that would lead him or her to think being a rebel in your home is cool, or that life has no answers and is just a ball of confusion, or you are a crazy person that should be ignored when you want them to think about boy-girl relationships in a biblical way, or that their lives are ruled by emotion. Remember, there is a destroyer, and he wants to bring misery to your family. He wants to snatch the truth out of their minds and replace it with godless thoughts. This is the battle. Tell your children today that you have become convicted of the need to protect your mind and theirs against ungodly thoughts by eradicating the love of worldly music. I know, it's going to be hard, but the blessings of walking in obedience to God will be so much greater. This is raising children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Ephesians 6:4. Much to think about. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.